I want to begin with a confession that many people on the spiritual path are too ashamed to make out loud. Since you began doing genuine inner work, since you started seeing your own patterns more clearly, feeling more deeply, becoming more honest with yourself, you have noticed something uncomfortable happening. You find people harder to be around. Not all people, and not all the time, but more often than before, and in ways that genuinely confuse you. Small talk feels unbearable. Certain personalities that never used to bother you now feel exhausting within minutes. You catch yourself irritated by behavior you once tolerated easily, impatient with conversations that go nowhere, and quietly repelled by a kind of performed positivity you used to participate in without a second thought. And underneath the irritation sits a quiet, guilty question. Is something wrong with me? Did the awakening make me worse? Gabor Maté spent 50 years sitting with people moving through exactly this disorienting phase, and he offered something that the spiritual self-help world rarely says clearly. This experience is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is not evidence that you've become bitter or arrogant or less loving than you used to be. It is, in almost every case he observed, a completely predictable and temporarily necessary stage of genuine psychological and spiritual development. And understanding why it happens changes your relationship to it entirely. Today, I want to walk you through exactly what is happening when awakening produces this disliking, why it is not the contradiction it appears to be, and what eventually lies on the other side of it. If this has been your experience, if your own waking up has come with an uncomfortable new impatience toward others that confuses you, drop 11 in the comments. 11, the frequency of the one who is seeing clearly for the first time and is unsettled by what that clarity reveals. When you type 11, you are saying, I am in this and I want to understand it honestly. Type 11. Let us look at this together. Gabor Maté made a distinction that is essential here. He distinguished between what he called false tolerance and genuine compassion. Before significant inner work begins, most people's apparent ease with others is built substantially on false tolerance, an absence of friction that comes not from genuine acceptance, but from a kind of mutual, unspoken agreement to remain at the surface. You did not dislike people before, partly because you were not yet perceiving clearly enough to notice what was actually happening beneath the surface of most ordinary interactions. The performance, the avoidance, the small dishonesties everyone participates in to keep things comfortable. As genuine awakening occurs, this surface-level ease becomes harder to maintain, for a very specific reason. You are not perceiving more accurately. You notice the gap between what someone is saying and what they're actually feeling. You notice when a conversation is genuinely connecting and when it is two people performing connection without anything real passing between them. You notice your own old patterns reflected back at you in other people's behavior, sometimes painfully clearly. None of this perceiving is unkind, but it does make the old, comfortable surface much harder to inhabit without friction. This produces the first thing I want you to understand. The new irritation you feel is frequently not irritation at the person in front of you at all. It is irritation at the falseness of the interaction itself, a falseness you simply could not perceive as clearly before. Gabor Maté observed that people in this phase very often misdirect this irritation onto individuals, when what is actually being registered is a broader, more impersonal discomfort with performed social interaction in general. I want to dwell on this distinction a little longer than I usually would because it carries more weight than it first appears to. When you misdirect a broad discomfort onto a specific individual, that person becomes unfairly the target of something that was never really about them. They become the friend who's too negative, or the colleague who's too fake, or the relative who's too shallow. Labels that feel accurate in the moment, but that often obscure the real source of the discomfort, which is the performance itself, not the particular performer. Recognizing this distinction does not mean every relationship deserves to continue unchanged. But it does mean that disliking deserves more honest examination before it is allowed to settle into a permanent verdict about another person's worth. Now I want to give you the 7 specific mechanisms behind this phase, because understanding each one individually makes the entire experience far less confusing and far less guilt-inducing. The first mechanism: you are encountering your own shadow reflected outward. We have explored this concept extensively in earlier conversations, but it belongs centrally here. Gabor Maté observed that the qualities which produce the strongest reactive dislike in others are almost always qualities we have not yet fully integrated in ourselves. As awakening progresses and shadow material begins surfacing into awareness, you become considerably more sensitive to that same material when it appears in other people. And your reaction to seeing it externally is often sharper and more uncomfortable than it would be once you have done more work with that material internally. This mechanism explains a particular and often confusing pattern. Why the people who irritate you most intensely during this phase are frequently not the people who are most objectively difficult, but the people who most closely resemble a quality you yourself are still struggling to accept. The person who seems excessively needy may be irritating you precisely because your own need has been sealed away and shamed for years. The person who seems excessively confident may be irritating you precisely because your own confidence has never been permitted full expression. The irritation is, in a very real sense, a mirror you have not yet learned to recognize as a mirror. The second mechanism: you have lost the specific energy that performed pleasantness required. Years of social performance demand a continuous, low-grade expenditure of energy, managing your tone, your expression, your apparent enthusiasm, regardless of what you actually feel. As authenticity increases through genuine inner work, this performance becomes more effortful rather than less, precisely because the gap between the performance and your genuine internal state has become more visible to you. Gabor Maté noted that many people in this phase experience ordinary social interactions as newly exhausting, not because the interactions changed, but because the performance now costs more than it once did. This particular shift catches many people off guard because it runs counter to what they expected from genuine inner work. They anticipated that becoming more whole, more integrated, more at peace with themselves would make social life easier. Instead, for a time, it makes certain kinds of social life considerably harder, precisely because the part of you that used to absorb the cost of performance without complaint is no longer willing to do so silently. The third mechanism: you're grieving the loss of relationships built on the old version of you. This phase frequently coincides with a quiet, often unacknowledged grief. Many existing relationships were built around a less awakened, more accommodating version of yourself, and as that version shifts, the relationships genuinely strain. The irritation you feel towards certain people is sometimes, underneath, a grief about a connection that can no longer function the way it used to, surfacing as impatience because grief that has not been named often expresses itself as irritability instead. Gabor Maté observed that this particular grief is rarely acknowledged directly, because acknowledging it requires admitting something genuinely painful. That a relationship you value may not survive your own continued growth in its current form. It is far easier psychologically to experience this as irritation at the other person's behavior than to sit with the harder truth that the relationship itself is changing shape, and that the change may eventually require a conversation, a boundary, or in some cases, a genuine ending that neither person wanted, but that the relationship's foundation can no longer support. The fourth mechanism: you are temporarily over-identified with your own clarity. Gabor Maté observes something he called the early clarity trap. When perception sharpens significantly, there is a common and temporary tendency to over-trust that new clarity completely. treating your own heightened perception as simply correct, rather than as one perspective among many, still developing, still capable of distortion. This over-identification frequently produces a subtle but real superiority, a sense of having finally seen what others have not yet seen, which generates its own particular flavor of impatience and disliking toward people who appear, from this vantage point, to be less aware. This trap is genuinely seductive precisely because the new clarity is in many respects genuinely more accurate than the perception that preceded it. The danger is not that the clarity is false. The danger is mistaking partial clarity for complete clarity and treating people who have not yet had your particular insights as simply behind you on a single linear path, rather than as people moving through their own complex, non-linear process that you cannot fully see from the outside. The fifth mechanism. Your nervous system is recalibrating its tolerance for stimulation. As inner work deepens, many people develop a genuinely lowered tolerance for overstimulating environments, noise, chaos, excessive socializing, prolonged exposure to other people's unprocessed anxiety. Gabor Maté noted that this is frequently a real physiological shift rather than simply a psychological preference, and it can easily be misread as disliking people, when what is actually occurring is a nervous system requiring more genuine quiet and regulation than it did before. This mechanism is particularly important to distinguish from the others because the appropriate response to it is different. Where shadow projection calls for inner work and grief calls for honest acknowledgement, a genuinely recalibrated nervous system calls for practical accommodation, shorter social engagements, more recovery time after interaction, environments that are less chaotic and overstimulating. Treating a physiological shift as though it were a purely psychological problem to be worked through can leave people exhausting themselves trying to force tolerance their actual nervous system genuinely no longer has the capacity for. The sixth mechanism, you are encountering the specific discomfort of genuine boundaries forming for the first time. For many people, this phase coincides with the first real development of personal boundaries after a lifetime of accommodating others by default. The discomfort of saying no, of declining invitations, of limiting time with draining people. This discomfort frequently expresses itself before the boundary is fully formed and comfortable as a generalized irritability toward the people the boundary is being formed in response to. Gabor Maté observed that this irritability tends to soften considerably once the boundary itself becomes more settled and less effortful to maintain. In the early stages, every boundary requires conscious, often uncomfortable assertion. And that effort generates a kind of background resentment toward the people who seem to require the boundary in the first place. As the boundary becomes simply a stable feature of how you operate, requiring less active defense, the resentment that accompanied its formation tends to dissolve along with the effort. The seventh mechanism, and the one Gabor Maté considered the most important of all. You are temporarily mistaking discernment for disconnection. This is the central insight of the entire conversation. Genuine spiritual and psychological maturation does eventually produce something that looks, from a distance, like disconnection, a withdrawal from certain kinds of relationship, certain kinds of interaction, certain people who consistently require you to perform rather than be genuine. But Gabor Maté was clear that this is not the actual destination of the process. The destination is discernment, a settled, clear-eyed capacity to recognize what kind of connection is genuinely nourishing and what kind is not, without the disliking, the irritability, or the subtle superiority that often characterizes the earlier transitional phase. The disliking phase, in other words, is real but temporary. It is what happens when new perception arrives before new equanimity has had time to develop alongside it. You can see more clearly than you could before, but you have not yet developed a settled capacity to hold what you see without reactivity. Gabor Maté observed that this gap between new seeing and new equanimity closes gradually through continued honest inner work, and that the disliking, in almost every genuine case he witnessed, eventually softens into something far more spacious. Not blind acceptance of everything, but a genuine, non-reactive compassion that can perceive someone's performance, their defensiveness, their unprocessed patterns, and respond with patience rather than irritation. Because the perceiving no longer threatens your own sense of ground. I want to be honest about the timeline here, because Gabor Maté never offered false comfort about how quickly this resolves. This phase can last considerably longer than people expect. Months, sometimes years, of genuinely finding people more difficult than you once did, even as your inner work continues, and even as you can see intellectually exactly what is happening and why. This is not evidence that the work is failing. It is the natural and necessary fiction of a nervous system and a perceptual system updating simultaneously at different speeds, with the gap between them producing exactly the discomfort you're experiencing. What helps in his clinical observation is treating the disliking itself with the same compassionate curiosity you would treat any other emerging material. Not suppressing it, not performing tolerance you do not genuinely feel, but also not mistaking the temporary disliking for a final settled truth about who you are or what you have become. The disliking is information about where you currently are in the process, not a verdict about your character, and not the destination of your awakening. There is one more thing Gabor Maté would want you to hear before we close, because it is easy to miss in a conversation focused this closely on disliking and irritation. The same heightened perception that makes performance harder to tolerate also makes genuine connection, when you do encounter it, considerably more vivid than it ever was before. People in this phase frequently report that while ordinary social interaction has become more taxing, the rare moments of real, unguarded connection, a genuinely honest conversation, a moment of mutual recognition without performance on either side, have become noticeably more meaningful than they used to be. This is not a coincidence. The same sensitivity that makes falseness harder to tolerate makes genuineness easier to recognize and receive. The disliking and the deepening capacity for connection are in fact two expressions of exactly the same underlying shift. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one Gabor Maté pointed toward across decades of witnessing exactly this kind of difficult, honest, unglamorous transition, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, including the parts of you that for now find people difficult. That difficulty is not the end of your compassion. It is quite often the beginning of a more honest version of it.